to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Today on Border Report Live, we are marking the end of an era for our team. We'll get into that a little bit later in this edition, but first, as always, we're going to start today by taking a look at what's trending across the border. A federal judge ordered that a South Texas man deported to Mexico 2 months ago be returned to the United States. Luis Roldan arrived in the United States when he was 3 years old. He was born in Reynosa, Mexico, and he says he is in the U.S. legally as a recipient of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, better known as DACA. His case is similar to other DACA recipients who have been deported by Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. This week, he crossed an international bridge to come home. Then, Roldan spent more than 5 weeks in Mexico after being detained on February 17th during an immigration appointment for his visa.
It hit me hard, I'm more grateful than anything that I'm back with my family. I miss them so much, and especially these little ones,
His legal proceedings are far from over. His attorney says they will continue to fight for his U visa. She says he currently has no court dates. The Board of Immigration Appeals has denied Mahmoud Khalil's latest attempt to dismiss his deportation case. The decision brings the former Columbia University student and Palestinian activist one step closer to possible expulsion. Khalil remains free on a separate judge's order in federal court. Khalil called the latest ruling biased and politically motivated. Khalil, a legal permanent resident, was the first publicly known arrest during the Trump administration's crackdown on non-citizens critical of Israel. He denies any connection to Hamas or allegations of anti-Semitism. His attorneys recently requested a U.S. appeals court reconsider a separate decision that found he could be deported. Watch this video as federal agents run after a man they say is a criminal and in the United States illegally. This ICE raid in Rancho Cucamonga, California, drew almost as many protesters as federal agents. The raid took place outside the courthouse on Thursday. Some of the agents were reportedly seen wearing ICE vests. Video of that incident showed protesters surrounded federal agents taking a man into custody. They were heard blowing whistles and yelling at officers to explain why they were arresting the man. Some yelled the men had attorneys. In a statement, the Department of Homeland Security said 3 migrants were arrested. All 3 had been reportedly arrested in the past for violent crimes and then released. 2 of the men are from Colombia and the 3rd from Mexico. As I said when we started this edition, today on Border Report Live marks the end of an era for our team. In just the past week, we are saying goodbye to not 1, but 2 Border Report correspondents. And today we're losing our longtime San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, as he moves on to his next chapter after more than 6 years with us. Now, during that time, Salvador has been on the front lines of some of the most complex and consequential border stories in the country, covering everything from migration and enforcement to cross-border commerce and humanitarian crises. And he's done it every single time with clarity, context, and a deep respect, most importantly, for the people at the center of those stories. Before he takes off, we wanted to bring Salvador on one last time to look back and revisit some of the stories that changed him, challenged him, and left a lasting impact over the years. Hey, Sal.
Rudy, thank you for the kind words. And trust me, Diana Maldonado, behind the scenes, Fernie Ortiz in El Paso helping us out, and Julian, Resendiz, of course, Sandra Sanchez. I've been blessed to be part of this team for 6 years. Best group I have ever worked with in my 38 years in journalism. And I'm sorry to go, but I'm very happy to be moving on. There's a lot more ahead of me, and I'm very excited with the move. I am about to be 62 years old, so it's time to do something that I really enjoy and not feel the pressure, the stress, because this job, as you know, Rudy, can be stressful at times, especially in this current political times.
And, speaking of stress, one of the most stressful times for journalists, not just, all along in the country, but across the world, was the COVID-19 pandemic. What were some of the things that you saw during COVID-19 when it was taking hold, and how did it impact people's lives on the border?
I remember I was just starting with Border Report, March of 2020, and we started hearing the stories, things that were happening all around the world. I remember coming back from Austin. I went for a training after just signing on with Border Report. I was coming back. I was on a plane flying back from Austin to San Diego. I was on the row seat, that was middle seat, and the gentleman on the window, and he kept coughing. And I remember thinking, oh my God, am I going to catch something? It's just the end of me. And so that started this paranoia that I think a lot of us felt and went through for many, many years. I got back, and it seemed like all of us, for several months at a time, all we were covering was stories about COVID-19, the virus, how it was spreading, how it was killing people, how there was this lack of tests, lack of vaccines. And that was happening a lot here in the San Diego-Tijuana region. One of the things that always struck me was the cooperation between San Diego County, the Mexican consulate in San Diego, and other county officials here. They began a vaccination program from people from south of the border. While San Diegans had access to the vaccines and tests, a lot of people, most people in Tijuana, in Baja California, did not. So many of them came north of the border to get these vaccines. Now, again, the San Diego County, the health department, the consulate, the U.S., the Mexican consulate in San Diego, and the business, the industry council started bringing these folks over. There you see some who were actually brought to the Ped West facility, which is one of the pedestrian crossings here at the San Isidro port of entry. They were bringing busloads of workers from maquiladoras, people who worked in these factories along the border. They were bringing them to the U.S. By the busload. Then they were crossing the border, getting their shots, and then they were walking back to Mexico. This was a show of cooperation between two governments, something that saved a lot of lives. And that always impacted me, because rarely do you ever see this this relationship between two countries, and together, Mexico, the U.S., local officials on both sides of the border helped save a lot of lives here, because they were saying, we may be healthy north of the border, but what's the point with so many people crossing on a daily basis? So indirectly, this virus was crossing the border back and forth daily. So that's why they decided we need to help our neighbors south of the border, even if we have to bring them north, and use resources that were meant for Americans and people here in San Diego.
Do you remember what it was like for people that were still in that time, at the very end of the first Trump administration, getting detained and put in detention facilities? What was the feeling like for those people?
I remember there was a lot of stressful times for folks. And quite frankly, they were ready to say goodbye to the first Trump administration. When President Biden took over in 2021, I remember just hundreds and hundreds of people started coming to the border, to communities, cities like Juarez and Tijuana. And here in Tijuana, they started building a camp. It just sort of grew overnight. They arrived at this place just about 200 yards from the actual border crossing in Tijuana at San Isidro. And they just started camping out because they thought that President Biden was going to swing the doors open and start allowing migrants. And they wanted to be close to the border, be first in line, so to speak, to get into the U.S. Now, this went on for months and months. The camp actually remained in place for more than a year with migrants from all over the world. We met folks from literally everywhere. And they were all telling us that, well, if it's going to happen, we want to be close to the border so we can get in. Of course, it never happened for them, because eventually people started getting sick. COVID-19 was rampant at the time. So health officials in Mexico said, this is a ticking time bomb. We need to get these people away from the area. They were doing the best they could. They brought in portable bathrooms. They had health care, but it was just basic health care because there were so many migrants there. Eventually, they started even giving them COVID-19 vaccinations. I remember seeing there were even mass weddings. People were getting married there. It became like its own little city within the city, just about 200 yards from the San Isidro port of entry. Eventually, the new administration came in, a new mayor came into Tijuana and said, we got to get get these folks out of here. They moved them out, put them into shelters, but soon enough, the shelters were running out of space, Rudy, because there were just thousands of people congregating, arriving in the city of Tijuana on a daily basis, hoping to cross the border. But as we now know, it became impossible for most of these folks who had to wait for many, many more months before even attempting to get into the U.S.
You know, I know down here in the South Texas, northern Tamaulipas region, when similar sites were happening and developing all across the U.S.-Mexico border, at one point, municipalities were just coming in and telling folks, we're clearing all this stuff out, and they were coming in with heavy machinery. Is that kind of the same way that they approach things in Tijuana? They
came in, they gave people warning, and they did it very, very late at night, early in the morning while the folks were asleep. They did pull up in buses, and police officers started ushering people out of the camp into the buses or away from the area. And then they started putting on fencing to keep everybody out. And they did it like in one night. They got everybody out. It was peaceful, stressful for the migrants, but they were able to get everyone out. It was obviously a planned, coordinated, and it was very successful. Folks kept coming back into the area, but because of the fencing and increased supervision, more police officers in the area, they kept just telling people to get out, move away, and they kept it from happening again.
You know, one of the things that the Trump administration, too, is, always touting, especially DHS, is the low number of migrant encounters that are happening compared to those 4 years of the Biden administration. What do you remember about the chaos as migrants seem to just kind of pour into the U.S. during President Biden's term in office?
I remember doing a story, and we actually called it a loophole. And I remember Customs and Border Protection was not happy about that. But the migrants found out that according to asylum laws, the way they were written in the U.S., they could come to the U.S., hop the border one way or another, and ask for asylum. And increasingly, people started doing it. The cartels created a smuggling network to simply get people over the border. It wasn't necessarily escorting them into cities like Los Angeles or Phoenix or big metropolitan areas. It was just simply getting them over the fence through the barriers, and then they were being told, just wait for Border Patrol agents and then surrender yourself, and eventually they will take you into custody, take you to a processing center, and then you can ask for asylum. And this got out of hand quickly. We had just thousands of people. This is an area called the Jacamba Hot Springs. There was a gap in the border barrier, and people were simply walking through it and into the U.S. Yes, at times they were waiting days at a time to get picked up because there were so many migrants. Border Patrol ran out of space where they could take the migrants to process them and house them, feed them. So a lot of them ended up camping out in the hills here in Jacamba, waiting for their turn to arrive so they can get going and begin their asylum process. Once in custody, according to the laws, they could stay in the U.S. So when a lot of people were describing them as illegal or undocumented, it wasn't quite right, because technically they were legal because they were following asylum laws that had been written into place during the Nixon administration in the early 70s. And these people came, and they came in big time numbers here in Jacamba. And at many other points along the border between San Diego and Mexico, we saw people from Asia, from South America, from Africa, different points around the world. And they were part of a huge migration that was happening all across the world. I remember speaking with a State Department official, and he was telling me that this is not just happening here, but it's happening all over the world. People are moving for various reasons, and this was just one of the areas that San Diego, Tijuana, the U.S., Mexico saw a lot of migrants. This is an area that Border Patrol deemed Whiskey 8, which is between the San Isidro port of entry and the ocean. Migrants were arriving and setting up between the two border barriers, waiting for the Border Patrol to pick them up. And it was just an amazing sight to see so many people congregating in one place, and somehow they had to be taken care of. And that was another big story that unfolded in the course of many, many months, several years, as a matter of fact.
Well, we'll talk more about that part of the story on the other side of the break. We're going to take a quick 2 minutes. We're back in that amount of time. Stay with us. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Joining us for the last time on Border Report Live, our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, here to talk about some of the most impactful stories to him as well as, us during his time here on Border Report Live and, of course, on borderreport.com for much longer than this thing has been on the air. One of the things we were talking about before we went into the break, Sal, was the amount of migrants streaming in during the Biden administration. We saw that Whiskey 8 location, as Border Patrol called it, but did they ever have to just drop migrants off into the city of San Diego?
And boy, did they ever. We discussed just tens of thousands of migrants waiting, camping out at various spots along the border between the Pacific Ocean and the mountains. You're talking about 60, 65 miles. There were many gaps in the border barrier, the fencing, and migrants would enter the U.S. at those spots, and then they would just sit there and wait. So Border Patrol would come, pick them up, and take them for processing. But it became overwhelming for the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection. They were shutting down one of the pedestrian crossings to allow for CBP officers to take new jobs to go and help process all these migrants. But of course, once they were processed, they couldn't stay at these stations. They had to clear them out. And the way they were doing it is by busing them away from Border Patrol substations. And they ended up busing them to a lot of transport centers, including the one you're seeing here. It's called the Iris Transit Center in South San Diego, a few miles from the border. And daily, there were just dozens and dozens of busloads of people being dropped off at this site. And from here, the migrants would go on. A lot of them would have taxis. People would pick them up. There was the mass transit system, buses and a trolley that for a time decided that not to charge the migrants. It was free. They could take them all the way to the San Diego International Airport where they could catch flights. And a lot of Border Patrol agents were actually taken off the lines, their regular jobs. They were taught how to drive buses just so they can move people back and forth all along the border and onto public facilities like the Iris Transit Center, where you're seeing now. And this became so big that what do you do with the people now that they're out in public in the cities of San Diego, for example? So the County of San Diego started investing millions of dollars for another processing site away from the border where they could bring some of these migrants, clean them up, feed them, help them with their paperwork, and actually buy them airplane tickets to get them away from the border to wherever they were going. Because one of the things that we found out, just about everyone who crossed the border, all these asylum seekers, they all had one thing in common. They all had a place to go. Someone was waiting for them to take care of them. Someone had a job for them. And so the idea became like, okay, let's get them away from the border to wherever they might be going, even if we have to spend money to buy them airline tickets. And that is what happened here in San Diego County for more than a year. The county taxpayers were putting up the airfare, the money for it, and a lot of these migrants took advantage of it. And this went on and on for a long time. Border Patrol just overwhelmed. There was no place for them to keep the migrants at the facilities. So all these people had to be taken somewhere, and they were dropped off at this a lot of transit sites, public sites around San Diego County. And it was something, a sight to behold. And you went there and spoke to these people, and it was amazing to see and to experience so many people from out of the country who were not from this part of the world. And they were just simply here with big dreams, big aspirations, trying to chase the American dream, so to speak.
You know, you mentioned all the help that, the federal government side of it, getting overwhelmed, pulling Border Patrol agents off the front lines, turning them into bus drivers, essentially. You mentioned, local governments trying to do what they could to help these people. But through all this, there were just a lot of good people trying to lend a hand and help the migrants. Tell us about some of the good Samaritans that you met along the way at the height of what some people have described as an invasion.
Well, the front line of help was a group of volunteers, basically, who saw a need, who saw migrants being stranded for days at a time with no food or water, no facilities, restrooms. So a lot of people jumped in to help. One of them was the American Friends Service Committee. They decided to go in there and they set up a big tent along the border at Whiskey 8 here and in other parts along the border between Tijuana and San Diego. And they started feeding the migrants, giving them bottles of water. They were even cooking up oatmeal, and people were bringing in sandwiches for these folks as they waited to be removed from the area by Border Patrol agents. And it became quite an effort, and they were there 24/7, and they did it for months at a time, helping the migrants. And other people too. I remember folks from every walk of life pretty much started arriving. There you see one of the volunteers, Nina Douglas, who was there a lot and handing out water. They had sanitizer. They even set up a cell phone charging station for the migrants so they could call their relatives or friends and remain in touch with people who were going to help them in their journey north of the border. And it was just amazing too. I will never forget talking to the migrants who were there, and they were so selfless in helping these folks because really they weren't getting paid. There was nothing in it for them except for the satisfaction of knowing that they were helping some people who were in bad need of support, perhaps a slice of pizza, some water, some crackers, or something that keeps them going until they were able to get removed from the area by Border Patrol agents. It was an inspirational effort, to say the least, Rudy. It was something that I will, as you said, never forget, because this acts of kindness repeated themselves over and over. And it was something that to behold, you see, like maybe humanity is kind down to its core. And I saw that many, many times over. And it was something that will always stick with me.
Unfortunately, we are running low on time, but I did want to ask you one last question, Sal. You've met so many people, not just migrants and volunteers and officials, but is there really just one individual that has, stood out to you over the years?
I did meet a lot of folks, and all had interesting stories. And I even handed out business cards and told them, once you get to the U.S., you call me and let me know. Some did, most did not, but it was okay. But one of the people that I met, and it was always by accident. I got an email from Panama, and this lady knew a group of immigrants or migrants who were planning to go into the U.S. They left Panama on their journey. They walked through Central America, Mexico, where they were robbed and beaten, and then they lost track of them. And eventually they ended up in Mexico. One of those young men who I met was a young man named Nabil Yunus. They were from Pakistan. They had fled Pakistan because they were Christians. And in Pakistan, they were being persecuted. There you see Nabil, who's in his mid-20s. Eventually, he got his green card, a permanent resident card, a few months back, just as he was graduating from the university up here in Cal State Channel Islands. He is now living in Denver, where he got a job as an engineer for a company there. There's his sponsor, Fitzgerald Kelly from San Luis Obispo, who took him in and helped him during his time here in the U.S. after he crossed the border. It's quite a story, amazing. There's his mom. He has not seen his mother in 5-6 years since they left Pakistan. But again, he's now a resident, legal resident here in the U.S. And he was telling me recently he will never forget jumping the border, the fence near Mexicali and Calexico. And that's where his journey into the U.S. actually began. And it was just something that's incredible. He was an example of what this migrant spirit to overcome obstacles, to improvise. And he has basically made it. He has become a legal resident. Again, he's already working. He hopes to become a U.S. citizen at some point, and said someday soon, maybe go back to Pakistan if he can visit his family, because he has not seen them for 5-6 years.
Well, Sal, unfortunately, we are out of time. But before we go, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for the incredible reporting you've done for BorderReport.com and Border Report Live, but for teaching me personally so much along the way about how to be a thoughtful, responsible, and most importantly, compassionate journalist. You've had quite the impact, not just on the people you've covered along the way, but all of us that have worked with you. And we're going to miss you, and we wish you nothing but the best.
Thank you, and I will definitely miss you. And like I told you, you're on to bigger and better things, my friend. You're going to do very well in this business.
Thank you, Sal. All right, stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes. Thanks so much for watching. For the last time for Salvador, Rivera, and San Diego, I'm Rudy Mireles in Harlingen. See you next time.